Okay, today I want to talk to you guys about the major political philosophers that went into creating the US Constitution. It's not that these people wrote the document, but they were the influence on the people that did. So it's important to understand them. Now, to start, we've got to start with something called the Enlightenment, which began roughly in the 1680s and went to about 1789. Now, the Enlightenment grew out of the scientific revolution and how that used logic and math to solve problems. They figured out gravity, they understood the model of the solar system. And so the idea was, well, if you could use logic to solve those science problems, you could also apply this to ideas about government, because that would then be useful because you still had poverty in the 16 and 1700s. Absolute monarchy didn't seem very logical. Why should it be the oldest child of the previous king? So the Enlightenment began to see, could we improve society by using logic, science, and reason? Now, of the variety of Enlightenment thinkers, the main thing to understand about them is that they did not approach it from where the power comes from God. They've approached it as it's all logical and it's a social contract. So there is an obligation between the subjects and the ruler, and it goes two ways. And this really does challenge the idea of divine right of kings, which said, my power comes from God. Now, the first thinker we want to talk about is Thomas Hobbes, who comes a little bit before the main Enlightenment, and his conclusions are a little different because he felt that without a strong ruler or a leviathan, which is like a big giant, that life is just going to be like Lord of the Flies. Everybody killing everybody. There's nobody to rein in anybody's worst instincts. And the famous quote is, life would be nasty, cruel, brutish, and short. But if people surrendered their power to the government and the state, it would protect the citizens and the contract would not be broken. And so that more or less was, yes, you should obey the ruler, but his power didn't come from God. What is significant is he was one of the first writers to actually use logic to back up his point. Now, there's Mr. Hobbes. And he also, his circumstances, why his outlook was so pessimistic. He was an advisor to the English King Charles I, who was beheaded during this bloody, messy civil war in the 1640s. So he saw people acting at their worst. And there's the cover of his book. You can see the Leviathan. Now, more importantly for the founding of the United States is John Locke. Who is famous because he formulated the idea that there are natural rights that people have, and they come from just nature and God, and nobody is allowed to, take these away. And his natural rights were life, liberty, and property. And if the government doesn't protect those rights, then the contract is broken and you can rebel. And he was an advisor to an English king and queen named William and Mary, who had a peaceful rebellion and took power. It was called the Glorious Revolution. And really, Thomas Jefferson basically stole Locke's ideas, and he just called it life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the real fundamental thing is the idea of natural rights, which we still believe in today. And there is a picture of Mr. Locke. He did support women's rights because he found that logical, although he was a little bit ahead of his time. Now, next philosopher also applies to things is a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You may know him. He's more famous for his phrase, cognito ergo sum, which is I think, therefore. Our next thinker was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You may know him most familiarly because he came up with the phrase cognito ergo sum, which is I think, therefore I am. But he's really important because his book, The Social Contract, basically hypothesized that people have the right to determine how they could be governed, and that the main duty of the government is it's a contract. They have to keep the people with as much freedom. And that was pretty typical of Enlightenment thinkers, that it's all about more freedom. And that's the main purpose of government, versus Thomas Hobbes, who said we need to keep people in line. And so again, politics and morality are separate. So that's a bit like Machiavelli, really separate things. And it's more about instinct and emotion. That's not particularly too important. But the state is created to preserve freedom. And that again, it's the idea of a contract. And so there's Mr. Rousseau. And our last thinker is a guy named, quite a name, Charles de Secondat de Baron de Montesquieu. Mostly people just call him Montesquieu. I sometimes call him Monty. His innovation was he studied England, and that he wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws. And basically his idea was that you don't want to have too much power in one person, and that the same people that interpret the laws should not be proposing laws. So the idea is you have a different system or different branches of government that will be checks and balances, which is another idea that we steal, where you divide up the power. And again, we are based on that structure. We'll be learning that in a few days. And again, rights of the individual matter. And there you go. And there's a nice picture of Monty. So this page just is useful because it will summarize all of these main philosophers. And these are the people that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and the various writers of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, that they are producing, and what goes into our founding